Good afternoon, Vikings. Welcome back to another edition of the Quarantine Chronicles. It's a great day to be great, man. It's a great day to be great. Today is Tuesday, April 14th, and we're continuing our discussion on slavery. So yesterday we ended up talking about, or I ended up talking about how slaves were treated and how they were fed on the slave ships. One thing that I neglected to mention yesterday was the fact that you did have some rebellions on these ships because again, these people were taken, these slaves were taken um, against their will. So of course there were going to be some people who were upset about this fact, and we're not going to just take it laying down. So you did have some rebellions. I do have a couple of images of those rebellions, well, just illustrations. Um, a moment. A couple of illustrations of people trying to break free. This is some of the equipment that people were chained using, and sometimes this was seen as used as a form of torture as well. But here you are. Oh, I'm sorry, this is dead or sick slaves being dumped over the ship. But this image over here kind of reflects the rebellions of slaves on these ships or future slaves on these ships. And occasionally they were successful. Most times, of course, the people who were armed won, but there were a few of these slave ships that were these rebellions on slave ships that were successful. Not entirely sure what the slaves did with the ships afterwards, but we do know that there were some rebellions on these slave ships that were successful going across the Atlantic slave trade. So today we want to talk about slave life in the Americas. So once the slaves actually got here, um, how were their lives as they became property of Americans back in the 1600s, 1700s, even the 1500s. There were some European nations that did have slaves over here in the 1500s. But looking at United States slavery or colonial slavery through the 1600s, 1700s, and into the 1800s. So you know how I love PowerPoints. So we're dealing with, again, slavery. So this is an example, obviously, of a cotton field in the Americas. Obviously, this isn't from slave time, but just imagine walking out into a plantation and seeing this much cotton and knowing that I'm going to be responsible. Me and the other slaves along with me are going to be responsible for picking all of this stuff, and we have to make sure that we get it before any of it goes bad. Um, just an example of a cotton field. Here is an example of some slave quarters from the outside. Again, obviously, this picture was taken well after slavery, so some of this stuff, some of this rust on the home might not have been there. But keep in mind that these homes weren't going to be in the best conditions anyway. Um, Windows, there's no shutters. You got it closed and you're in the dark and it's hot, or you got it open to let some airflow and some light in. There is no in between. There is no screen or any blinds. Here's a family out in the slave fields or out in the cotton fields. We know how big cotton is. So imagine having to pick enough cotton to fill up these big barrels. If slaves were to be disobedient, obviously you're not going to get me to keep doing work without having something to make sure I keep doing work. So torture and punishment was used. This man was whipped in the back. Here's a piece of the caption I saw said farm equipment. My only thought is this could be something that you could uh like kind of hold the fields or plow the fields, but I'm not really seeing how that's possible. So this might have been a piece of torture equipment as well. Here's the inside of the slave quarters. Got a fireplace, well that's nice. Um, some cots on the floor, bed, a little bedding on the floor, a couple of chairs. Might not look like it's that bad considering from what we know of slavery. But keep in mind that there are probably multiple families living in this one area. Why do I need a fire? Again, why am I going to treat my slave with any type of dignity? Well, there are some things that you have to do for the slave just to make sure that they are healthy, because a healthy slave is going to make you more money and work harder than a non-healthy slave would. So if you are dying, or if you are freezing during the night and you wake up with a cold, or you have a flu, then you can't work as hard. Or if you die from being too cold, and or catch hypothermia, or anything that comes from not being somewhat comfortable, then you're not going to make me money. You're going to cost me money, because I still have to take care of you. I still have to feed you, but you're not able to go out and produce any work. So we're going to give you something to keep warm. Bucket. That bucket might have been the bathroom, unless you wanted to go outside. Let's go back, and some bedding. Here is a monument to the slave trade or it's not really a monument to the slave trade. It's more of something done in memory, or like, remember what happened. This is in Tanzania. This guy seems to have broken free. Good for him. So interesting to know that not every white American in the South owned slaves. And keep in mind that slavery did exist in the North before, at a certain time period in our history. It wasn't just always in the South, but there were more plantations in the South. And by the time that the Missouri Compromise was passed, then slavery was definitely relegated to the South. But at one time, there were slaves in the North. But then keep in mind that not every white family had slaves. Not everybody was rich enough to have slaves, because slaves did cost money. Not only did you have to buy them, which we'll see an ad for a slave, or an ad for an auction in a few slides. Not only did you have to buy them, but you also had to feed them and make sure that they were healthy. So most families who owned slaves only owned 1 to 4 slaves. Then you had a good portion, a little less than a quarter of the people who owned slaves owned between 5 and 9 slaves. Even fewer people owned double-digit slaves, 10 to 19. Some people were crazy rich and had 20 to 49 slaves. And then there was a small percentage of people, and it was usually the elite, people like George Washington, people like Thomas Jefferson, who owned 50 or more slaves. We know that George Washington owned upwards of 250. Thomas Jefferson owned upwards of 200 slaves. But again, not every white family owned slaves. Not to say that just because you didn't own a slave didn't mean that you didn't think slaves were inferior. You might not have been able to afford it, or you just might have been against slavery in general, but it doesn't mean that you thought that these Africans were still on the same level as you. Here's an example of a slave auction. Notice that there's not just adults up here. This woman over here is holding a baby. Here's a small child here. There's small children on these steps. I'm not entirely sure what this is supposed to be. Maybe it's an animal or something. And then you have the white Americans around bidding on these slaves. And again, slaves cost money. They were a decent source of revenue in the South. So not only did they farm in the South, but also you had slave drivers who made a living off of selling slaves in the South. So that was a part of the Southern economy during the Industrial Revolution and before. Another image of a slave auction. The custom, read the caption, the custom of in Washington, the capital of the United States. So at one point, the United States was selling slaves, selling citizens, people who are citizens now, or the descendants of those slaves who are citizens now. They were being sold in the U.S. Capitol. So we didn't see the ad that I was thinking about here. But give me a moment. Let me see if I can find it. Before I get to that, I can find this. Here's some torture and punishment equipment. So you ain't acting right. All right, we're gonna restrict your head movements. We're gonna cover up, muzzle up your mouth, and then we're gonna have these utensils here that we can make this tighter on your neck and shorten your breath. Same image of this man with welts from being whipped on his back. And here's another piece of torture equipment. So I went through, and I guess no, there. Give me one. More. All right, so I have a different graphic that I want to show you, talking about the price of slaves. So in 1804, you see the year going across the bottom here. You will see the actual price of the average actual price, meaning without considering what the dollar amount or what the dollar value was then versus now. Back in 1804, people were paying $300 on average for slaves. It dipped down a bit, as we can see, but at the highest in 1861, as the slave trade started dying out, people were paying upwards of $800 to have a slave. Now let's look at that in terms of dollars in 2009, which will somewhat correlate, because our dollar is similarly valued now in 2020 as it was in 2009. So in 2009, the value of those slaves that were only costing about $300, if it was money that we were spending today, would have been around $70,000 to $75,000 per person, and then at its height would have been over $135,000 that people would have been paying for slaves. So slavery was a lucrative business for those who could get their hands on slaves and who were able to trade slaves. All right, so I was able to come across a ad for a slave, and here it is. So here is a slave dealer putting out an ad to try to get people to come to this auction in order to purchase Africans, purchase other people to come and work for them. So says the slave has just received, or I'm sorry, this person has just received from North Carolina 25 young Africans to which he desires the attention of purchasers. So he's trying to sell off these 25 Africans that he had just acquired from North Carolina, and he's trying to sell them in an auction. So that I'm not going to set a price. I'm going to let you set the price. How much ever you want to pay for this slave, come and get them. Now, of course, people, slave owners or people in the market for slaves were in the market for them for different reasons. I might have needed somebody to work in the house and be around my family. So what I'm looking for might change. I might need somebody to be big and strong and be out in the field. So of course I'm going to look for a slave that I think is strong enough to do the work that I need him to do. So it was a different practice. It was something that we're not accustomed to these days, especially when you talk about the auctioning off of people. Didn't just keep slaves in bondage simply because you told them, yo, you're a slave because you're black, and slaves aren't going around saying, yo, that works for me. So you did have rebellions. You did have people who wanted to step out and try to break free from the slavery. One person in particular that we know of here in North America, the most famous slave rebellion that we know of, even though it was not successful, was Nat Turner. Nat Turner tried a rebellion. Nat Turner was a preacher who tried to rebel against his owners in Virginia, I believe it was. You can fact check me on that. And he was able to go around, and he convinced his followers, and they did have some white Americans who were on their side, to go forth and try to stamp out the white people in his area. They were killing men, obviously, but they did not shy away from women, and in some cases, they did not shy away from children. But these men, Nat Turner and his followers, felt that this was the price that needed to be paid for them to achieve liberty and achieve freedom. Again, unsuccessful in the end, but there was a slave rebellion that was successful, not here in North America, or at least not, this isn't the one that I'm talking about, but in Haiti. In Haiti, the Haitian Revolution, where you had all of the slaves rebel against their French overlords and were successful. They ousted the French from Haiti. So there's a reason why your Haitian friends, the Creole, is called French Creole, because Haiti was at one point under the rule of the French, but those Haitian slaves were successful in their rebellion, and now Haiti belongs to those people, those descendants of those slaves. Um, that is how the United States was able to come across the Louisiana Territory. And this is talking about Standard 4.12, in which you examine the effects of the Haitian Revolution on the U.S. acquisition of the Louisiana Territory. I know we talked about the Louisiana Purchase a long time ago, but now we're just talking about slavery and we're talking about rebellions. So now we're going to talk about how that tied in. Well, when the Haitian slaves were successful in revolting against the French, then Napoleon decided, yo, it's best for me to just cut my losses. Let me focus on what's going on in Europe because I'm at war with Great Britain over here. Let me not have to worry about what's going on in the West. So let us get all of our French forces out of North America, out of the Western Hemisphere, bring them back over here so we can fight, and then we'll eventually turn our attention back over. So Napoleon was trying to figure out a way to get out of North America in general. So he sold off once Jefferson came get uh, trying to get New Orleans from the French. Napoleon saw this as an opportunity to get out of North America in general. So instead of just selling New Orleans and Florida to the Americans, Napoleon sold the whole Louisiana Territory to Jefferson and the Americans. So that was how the Haitian Revolution um, affected the U.S. acquisition of the Louisiana Territory, because Napoleon decided once he lost Haiti that it was time to get out of North America and get out of the Western Hemisphere in general. Um, Again, trying to keep it brief. Tomorrow we'll come in and we will start to talk more about sectionalism, which still ties into slavery. The divisions of the country were based off of thought and based off of culture and based off of beliefs. And so you'll see some of these states that believe that we should have slaves band up against those states that believe or that didn't have slaves. And we talk about how the West was influenced by this slave versus free state debate. Till tomorrow, have an excellent rest of your day, guys.